The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but Glenn hadn't moved to reheat it. 3 in the morning, and he was still sitting at the kitchen table. That credit card statement spread out under the lamp like evidence at a crime scene. He'd read every line a dozen times, hoping the numbers would rearrange themselves into something that made sense. 2 resort rooms booked, one canceled at check-in, $847 in bar charges before 7 p.m. And there, third line from the bottom, Kevin's flight change fee, $320. Kevin. Glenn's hand had crumpled the paper twice already. Each time he'd smoothed it flat again, his calloused fingers pressing out the wrinkles like he was trying to press out the truth. Through the kitchen window, dawn was breaking over the bitterroots. The furnace clicked on. Glenn still hadn't moved. His phone buzzed on the table. Linda's text lit up the screen. Landing in 2 hours. Can you pick me up? He stared at those words, then back at the statement. What the hell happened at that resort? Glenn drove to the airport like a man headed to his own hanging. He'd showered, shaved, put on a clean shirt, all the motions of a normal pickup, except his hands kept tightening on the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. The arrivals board said her flight had landed 20 minutes ago. He found her by baggage claim, pulling her suitcase off the carousel. She looked tired, makeup smudged under her eyes. When she saw him, she smiled, but it didn't reach anywhere that mattered. Hey, she said and kissed his cheek. Her lips barely touched his skin. Hey yourself. Glenn took her suitcase. Good trip? Linda's smile flickered. Let's just get home. The drive back was 90 miles of silence, broken only by the hum of tires on asphalt. Linda stared out the passenger window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. Glenn kept his eyes on the road, and his questions locked behind his teeth. I'm sorry I cut it short, she finally said, somewhere past the turnoff to Drummond. The resort just felt wrong somehow. I got homesick. Homesick. Glenn thought about that word, thought about the $847 in bar charges, thought about Kevin's name on their credit card statement. It's all right, he heard himself say. I'm just glad you're back safe. Linda reached over and squeezed his hand. Her palm was cold. That evening, she cooked his favorite roast beef. Hadn't cooked in months. Usually it was frozen casseroles or sandwiches eaten standing at the sink. But tonight she had the oven on, potatoes roasting, green beans steaming. The kitchen smelled like Sunday dinner at his mother's house, back when Sunday dinners were still a thing. Glenn sat at the table, watching her move around the kitchen. She was humming. Actually humming, something she hadn't done since... when? He couldn't remember. You feeling all right? He asked. Just happy to be home. She glanced back at him, and for a second he saw something in her face. Guilt, maybe, or relief. I missed this, missed you. The words should have warmed him. Instead, they sat in his chest like stones. After dinner, she rubbed his shoulders while he sat in his father's old recliner. Her hands worked the knots in his neck, and he closed his eyes, trying to let himself believe everything was fine, trying to forget that statement folded up in his truck's glove box. I've been thinking, Linda said softly. Maybe we should take a trip together, just the two of us. When's the last time we did that? Glenn opened his eyes. Been a while. Too long, her hands stilled on his shoulders. I want things to be good again, Glenn, like they used to be. That night, she initiated intimacy for the first time in months. Glenn lay beside her afterward, staring at the ceiling, listening to her breathing even out into sleep. Everything about the past 8 hours felt like a performance, like she was trying too hard, like she was scared, or like she was sorry. He turned his head on the pillow, studying her face in the darkness. 38 years of marriage, and he couldn't tell anymore what she was thinking. When had that happened? When had they become strangers sharing a bed? The next 4 days passed in a strange haze of almost normal. Linda kept cooking, kept being affectionate, kept acting like the woman he'd married instead of the one who'd grown cold and distant over the past year. Glenn wanted to believe it. God, he wanted to believe it. On the 5th day, he found the credit card statement still folded in his glove box. He sat in his truck outside the barn, holding that piece of paper, thumb running over the crease where he'd folded it. The December wind rattled the truck's windows. His breath fogged in the cold. Throw it away, he told himself. She came back. She's trying. That's what matters. But his hand wouldn't move toward the trash. Instead, he refolded the statement carefully and tucked it into his wallet, behind his driver's license where Linda would never look. Just in case. Just in case what? He didn't have an answer for that. He was climbing out of the truck when Roy Mercer's pickup pulled up the drive. Roy owned the hardware store in town, had known Glenn since high school. Good man, Solid man. Man who'd been divorced himself years back, though he didn't talk about it much. Roy shut off his engine but didn't get out right away. Just sat there, looking at Glenn through the windshield. Finally, he opened the door and climbed down, slow and deliberate. "Roy," Glenn said, "I need something? Saw your truck at the coffee shop 3 mornings running this week?" Roy leaned against his tailgate, arms crossed. "That ain't like you." Glenn felt his face heat up. "Just needed to think." "Yeah." Roy was quiet for a moment. "Listen, I don't know what's going on, and you don't have to tell me. But my nephew practices family law over in Billings. Good lawyer. Honest." He pulled a business card from his shirt pocket, held it out. "Just in case you ever need someone to talk to. Professional-like." Glenn stared at the card, didn't take it. Roy set it on the truck's hood. "And this." He pulled a small flip phone from his other pocket. "Burner phone, the kind you bought at gas stations with cash. Clean number, nobody knows it but me. If you ever need to make a call, you don't want showing up on your regular bill." "Roy, you don't have to explain." Roy's voice was gentle but firm. "Just saying, if it's nothing, you won't need any of this. But if it ain't nothing..." He trailed off, let the words hang in the cold air. "You'll be glad you got it." Glenn picked up the business card. The phone. Both felt heavier than they should. "Thank you," he managed. Roy nodded, climbed back in his truck. Before he drove off, he leaned out the window. "Glenn, whatever it is, you ain't alone in it. Remember that." The truck disappeared down the drive, leaving Glenn standing there with a lawyer's card in one hand and a burner phone in the other, wondering what the hell Roy had seen in his face that morning at the coffee shop. 3 days later, Roy's nephew called the burner phone. Glenn was in the barn, mucking out stalls when it rang. The sound startled him so bad he nearly dropped his pitchfork. He'd forgotten he even had the damn thing in his coat pocket. "Mr. Hutchins, this is David Mercer. My Uncle Roy asked me to reach out." Glenn stepped outside into the December cold, away from the horses. "I didn't ask him to call you." "I know, but he's worried about you, and frankly, so am I after what I found." The lawyer's voice was professional but kind. "Do you know a Kevin Thornton?" Glenn's stomach dropped. "What did you find?" "Instagram profile, public account, posted photos from a resort in Arizona 2 weeks ago." A pause. "Your wife is visible in several of them." The world tilted sideways. Glenn leaned against the barn wall, rough wood catching on his coat. "Send them to this number," he said. The photos arrived 10 minutes later. Glenn sat in his truck, hands shaking as he scrolled through them on the burner phone's tiny screen. Kevin at the resort pool, tanned, fit, younger than Glenn by a decade at least, gym rat build, the kind of guy who took selfies. And there, in the background of the fourth photo, Linda, in a hot tub, laughing, drink in hand. The timestamp said 6:47 p.m., October 23rd. The same evening she'd called him crying, saying she was homesick and booking a flight home. Glenn zoomed in on her face. She didn't look homesick, she looked happy. He sat there until his breath fogged the windows, until he couldn't see the photos anymore through the condensation. Then he started the truck and drove home. Linda was in the kitchen when he came through the door. She looked up from her coffee, smiled. "You're back early. I was thinking about making that chicken thing I need to talk to you about something." The smile died. "What?" Glenn pulled out his phone, his real phone, not the burner, and opened their bank app. Found Emma's wedding fund account, the one they'd been building for 5 years, the one that should have had $40,000 in it from selling his father's John Deere collection. "Why does this show 25,000? Linda's face went pale. "I can explain." $15,000, Linda. Where'd it go?" Emma's wedding planner needed a deposit. "We don't have a wedding planner." Glenn's voice was quiet, deadly calm. "Emma's doing everything herself. So I'm asking again, where'd the money go?" Linda stood up, chair scraping against the floor. "You went through my accounts?" "Our accounts. Joint accounts." He pulled up the transaction history, turned the phone toward her. "Kevin Thornton, $15,000, 3 weeks before your girls' trip." Her face crumpled, then hardened into something he'd never seen before. "You had someone investigate me? You had someone tracking my accounts?" "Answer the question." "No." She grabbed her purse off the counter. "No, I'm not doing this. You want to play detective? You want to invade my privacy? You stole our daughter's wedding money." The words came out louder than he meant them. "That was my father's tractors, Linda. Every penny of it. And you gave it to some guy I've never heard of so you could, what, run off to Arizona with him? Linda's face twisted with something ugly. You suffocated me. 38 years of this ranch, this boring, dead-end life. Her voice cracked. You're just like your father. Silent, emotionally dead, expecting me to just be grateful for this prison. The words hit like a physical blow. Glenn stepped back. Kevin listens to me, she continued, crying now. He sees me as a woman, not a maid, not someone to cook and clean and disappear into the background of your precious cattle operation. I gave you everything I had. You gave me nothing. She was screaming now. Nothing but silence and this godforsaken ranch and a life so small I can't breathe in it. Glenn stood there, words dying in his throat, because part of him, the part that inherited his father's quiet, his father's way of working through problems without talking about them, knew she was right. He had been silent. He had assumed steady presence was the same as love. But the other part, the part that had worked himself to the bone for 38 years, that had sold his father's legacy piece by piece to give their daughter a better start, that part wanted to rage. He did neither, just stood there like a fence post, silent and immovable. I'm going to Carol's, Linda said, grabbing her coat. I'm not coming back until you apologize for snooping and trying to control me. Linda, no. She was at the door now. You want to save this marriage? You figure out how to let me breathe. The door slammed. Through the window, he watched her throw a bag in her car, watched the taillights disappear down the drive. Glenn walked to his father's recliner and sat down. The leather creaked under his weight, same sound it had made when his father sat here silent and immovable until the day he died. He tried to cry, couldn't. His chest felt like someone had poured concrete into it. The house was so quiet he could hear the kitchen clock ticking, hear the furnace cycling, hear his own breathing, slow and steady, the breathing of a man who was drowning but didn't know how to call for help. His phone buzzed. Emma, calling to ask about something wedding-related, probably. Glenn stared at her name on the screen until it stopped ringing, until the voicemail notification appeared. He couldn't talk to her, couldn't tell her, couldn't break her heart before the happiest day of her life. The silence pressed down on him like a thumb. The days that followed had a strange, underwater quality to them. Glenn moved through the ranch work like a ghost, feeding cattle at dawn, checking fence lines, repairing the water trough that had frozen and cracked. All the physical labor that used to quiet his mind just made him more aware of the silence. Linda's texts came sporadically, short, cold. When you're ready to apologize, we can talk. Glenn didn't respond, didn't know what to say that wouldn't make things worse. On the fourth day, he forced himself to go into town, needed feed for the horses, couldn't put it off any longer. The grain co-op was busy for a Wednesday morning. Bill's truck parked out front, Frank's, a couple others he recognized. Glenn sat in his truck for 10 minutes, hand on the door handle, trying to make himself go in. Through the window, he could see them gathered around the coffee station laughing about something. His Wednesday morning ritual for 30 years. But what if they knew? What if Linda had talked to Carol, and Carol had talked to someone, and now the whole damn town knew that Glenn Hutchins couldn't keep his wife happy? He released the door handle, put the truck in reverse, drove home without the feed. Sunday, he made it as far as the church parking lot. Sat there, with the engine running, watching families file through the front doors, in their Sunday clothes. Heard the organ music start up, that same opening hymn they'd been singing since he was a boy. His hand reached for the door, froze. He couldn't walk in there, couldn't sit in that pew where everyone could see him, alone, could count the empty space where Linda should be sitting. Glenn drove home. First time he'd missed church in 30 years. Monday morning, he ran out of coffee. Had to go to town, no getting around it. He chose the diner instead of the co-op, smaller, fewer people. Slid into his usual booth, ordered coffee and eggs from Mary, who'd been waitressing there since before he was married. How's Linda? Mary asked, refilling his cup. Good, she's good. The lie tasted like ash. 2 booths over, Kenny the pastor was sitting with Bill, deep in conversation about something. Glenn caught fragments, something about the church furnace, about ordering parts, normal conversation, nothing to do with him. Then Glenn sat down with his coffee, and they stopped talking mid-sentence. The silence stretched out for 3, maybe 4 heartbeats. Then Kenny cleared his throat, and they started up again, quieter now, about something else entirely. Glenn stared at his eggs, appetite gone. They knew, had to know. The way they'd stopped talking, the way they'd changed subjects, they knew, and they were being polite about it, which was somehow worse than if they'd just asked him straight out. He left a $5 bill on the table and walked out without finishing his breakfast. That afternoon, he called Linda's lawyer nephew back, made an appointment, drove the 90 miles to Billings, sat in a clean office that smelled like new carpet and furniture polish. David Mercer was younger than Glenn expected, maybe 35, but he had Roy's eyes, kind eyes, honest. Montana's a no-fault divorce state, David explained, papers spread across his desk. Infidelity doesn't affect asset division, even with proof. Glenn leaned forward. What about dignity? David's expression softened. Can't argue that in court, Mr. Hutchins. I'm sorry. Glenn drove home in silence, radio off, just the hum of the engine and the whistle of wind through the truck's window seal. 90 miles to learn that the law didn't care if your wife had betrayed you, didn't care about 38 years of building a life together, didn't care that she'd stolen your daughter's future to fund an affair. The law didn't care about a damn thing except dividing assets down the middle. That evening, Linda's sister Carol called. Glenn almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Glenn, we need to talk about Linda. I'm listening. She's finally found some happiness. Carol's voice had that sharp edge it always got when she was gearing up for a fight. With Kevin, and you need to let her go. Glenn's grip tightened on the phone. Let her go? Your cowboy stoic act isn't strength, Glenn. It's emotional abuse. Kevin actually listens to her. He sees her. Kevin stole $15,000 from our daughter's wedding fund. Linda said that was a misunderstanding. It wasn't. Glenn's voice was flat. And if you're calling to tell me I'm the problem, you can save your breath. You've had her for 38 years. That's long enough. Glenn hung up, sat there staring at the phone, feeling like he'd just been recast as the villain in someone else's story. His phone buzzed again, Emma this time. He let it go to voicemail. Listened to it later. Dad, what's going on? Mom won't talk to me about you, and you're not answering. Are you guys splitting up? Call me back. Please. Glenn deleted the message. Couldn't call her back, couldn't lie well enough, couldn't tell the truth without destroying her. Outside, the December wind howled across the ranch, rattling the windows, making the old house creak and settle. Glenn sat in the gathering darkness alone and wondered how much more he could take before something in him broke for good. The weather report came on the radio Tuesday afternoon while Glenn was splitting firewood. Freak blizzard rolling in from Canada, expected to hit by evening. Unusual for Montana this late in December, the weatherman said, but when had weather ever played by the rules? Glenn was stacking the last of the wood when Margaret's sedan came up the drive. Margaret Haas, his bookkeeper for 30 years. Widow now since last spring when her husband died. She kept butterscotch candies in her purse and had never missed a deadline in her life. Got your tax documents, she called through her window. Need your signature. Glenn wiped his hands on his jeans, met her on the porch. She spread the papers on the railing, showed him where to sign. Her reading glasses kept sliding down her nose, and she pushed them back up with one finger, a gesture he'd seen 1,000 times. Coffee? He offered. More out of habit than hospitality. Better not. That storm's coming in faster than they thought. But even as she said it, the first flakes started falling, big wet ones that meant business. By the time they'd finished with the paperwork, the snow was coming down sideways. Margaret looked at her car, then at the drive already disappearing under white. Guest room's made up, Glenn said. You're not driving in that. She didn't argue. Dinner was awkward, frozen casserole reheated in the oven, the two of them eating at opposite ends of the table, making small talk about cattle prices and whether the furnace needed servicing. Margaret was too polite to ask about Linda's absence, and Glenn was too tired to explain. After dinner, Margaret started clearing plates. That's when she saw it. The resort booking confirmation Glenn had printed out days ago and forgotten about, half buried under the newspaper on the kitchen table. She picked it up without thinking, then froze when she saw what it was. 2 rooms booked, 1 canceled same day. Glenn came back from putting leftovers in the fridge and saw her holding the paper. His face went hot. That's not... I've seen this before, Margaret said quietly. She set the paper down, careful, like it might explode. Different context, same pattern. Glenn wanted to take the paper, throw it away, pretend she hadn't seen it, but something in her face stopped him, not pity, recognition. My husband died of a stroke last April, she said. Stress from his business partner stealing from him. $73,000 over 2 years. She pulled out a chair, sat down heavy. I didn't catch it until it was too late. I was the bookkeeper for their company, Glenn. It was my job to see the pattern, and I missed it. Margaret, I'm sorry. I live with that every day. She looked up at him, and her eyes were dry but fierce. wondering if he'd still be alive if I'd paid better attention, if I'd looked at the right accounts at the right time. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Snow piled against the glass. "If you want," Margaret said, "I can look at your accounts, bookkeeper to bookkeeper, see if there's a pattern worth seeing." Glenn stood there, pride warring with desperation. 30 years of doing things himself, handling his own problems, not asking for help. How long would it take? "Give me tonight." Glenn tried to sleep. Couldn't. Around 2 in the morning, he came downstairs and found Margaret still at the kitchen table, laptop open, papers spread everywhere, reading glasses reflecting the screen's glow. A butterscotch wrapper sat next to her coffee cup. "Made fresh coffee," she said without looking up. "Pot's still hot." Glenn poured himself a cup, sat down across from her, waited. Margaret took off her glasses, rubbed her eyes. When she looked at him, her face was grim. "This goes back 8 months." Glenn's hand tightened on his cup. "Santa Fe in February, Portland in April, Boise in June, Phoenix in August, Arizona in October." She turned the laptop toward him, showed him a spreadsheet with every transaction highlighted. Hotel charges, flight changes, cash withdrawals, total of $23,147 from your joint savings. The number sat in Glenn's chest like a stone. 8 months. The memo lines all say book club, or girls retreat, or Linda personal. Margaret pulled out another page. Then there's the Venmo transfers. To Kevin Thornton. Started in March, 300 here, 500 there, total of 4,800. Plus the 15,000 from Emma's fund, Glenn heard himself say. Margaret nodded. Grand total, $42,947. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, the blizzard was easing, the worst of it passed. Dawn was maybe an hour away. Glenn stared at the numbers, watching his retirement savings disappear line by line into someone else's life. 8 months, not a mistake, not a moment of weakness, a plan, a systematic dismantling of everything they'd built. "What do you want to do?" Margaret asked. "I don't know yet." She slid the printed ledger across the table. Every transaction dated, highlighted, itemized. "You don't have to decide now, but you have the facts." Glenn picked up the ledger, felt the weight of 8 months of lies in his hands. The Arizona trip wasn't when it started. It was just when she got sloppy. Everything before that had been careful, calculated, covered. "Thank you," he managed. Margaret gathered her things, but before she left the kitchen, she turned back. "Glenn, this wasn't an affair. This was embezzlement." The word hung in the air long after she'd gone upstairs. Roy called the next evening, after Margaret had made it home safe and the roads were plowed. "Come to the store tonight, 7 o'clock, back office." "What for?" "Just come." Glenn almost said no, almost stayed home with his shame and his ledger and his dying marriage. But something in Roy's voice, not pity, not charity, just solid expectation, made him shower, put on a clean shirt, and drive into town. Roy's hardware was closed when Glenn arrived, but lights were on in the back. He went around to the service entrance, knocked once, and Roy opened the door. The back office was crowded. 5 men, all 60 or better, all holding coffee in mismatched mugs. Roy, Kenny from the church, still in his pastor's collar, Bill from the feed store, Frank from the co-op, and Dale, the retired sheriff, white-haired and weathered. "What is this?" Glenn asked. "Old Bulls Council," Bill said. "Every man in this room's been through fire, different fires, same heat." Glenn wanted to turn around and leave. Didn't need their pity, didn't need to be somebody's charity case. But Roy was already pulling out a chair for him, and somehow Glenn found himself sitting. "I don't need—" "My first wife cheated on me with my business partner," Bill interrupted. His voice was matter-of-fact, like he was discussing the weather. 20 years ago, I stayed silent about it, tried to tough it out, nearly killed me. Literally, heart attack at 52. Kenny leaned forward. "My sister's husband cleaned out their accounts before he filed for divorce. Left her with nothing. She was too embarrassed to tell anyone until it was too late. Lost her house, her car, everything. My son's mother moved to California," Frank added. "Lied in court about abuse that never happened. Took me 3 years and $30,000 in lawyer's fees to get visitation rights." He took a sip of coffee. "Evidence saved me. Wish I'd started gathering it sooner." Dale spoke last, his voice gravelly from 40 years of smoking before he quit. "I worked domestics for 23 years as sheriff. Saw this pattern 100 times. The person who documents first is usually the person who protects what matters." Glenn looked around the circle. every face weathered, every man carrying scars he couldn't see. "We ain't here to tell you what to do," Roy said, "but we are here to say you're not alone, and you've got options." The door opened, and Roy's nephew David came in, briefcase in hand. He spread papers on the table, the same papers Glenn had seen in his office, but marked up now, annotated. "Montana's no fault for divorce," David said, "but that doesn't mean you're defenseless. We can protect the ranch, restore Emma's fund, ensure fair division of assets." "How?" Glenn's voice came out rougher than he meant. "Emma's fund was designated savings. Your wife transferred it without authorization. That can be argued separately from marital assets. We can get that $40,000 restored as a condition of settlement." David pulled out another document. "The ranch has debt against it, but your wife's mother's house is paid off. We propose she keeps the house, you keep the ranch. Fair division, clean break." "Without a trial?" "Mediation, private. Emma never has to know the details." Glenn sat back, processing. "And Linda would agree to this? If the alternative is discovery phase, where everything becomes public record? Yes. Most people choose privacy over principle." The men around the table were quiet, letting Glenn think. "Whatever you decide," Roy finally said, "we're standing with you, at church, at the co-op, at the diner, visible. So folks know you've got people." Bill nodded. "Been hiding long enough, Glenn. Time to let us be your fence line." Glenn's throat went tight, couldn't speak, just nodded. They shook hands all around, firm grips, no words needed. When the others filed out, Roy hung back. "One more thing," Roy said quietly. "Kevin's got a LinkedIn profile. Says he's married. Wife's name is Karen, elementary school principal over in Missoula." Glenn absorbed this. "You sure?" "Checked it 3 times. Posted a photo with her last summer. Wedding rings visible. Does she know? About your wife? Doubt it." Roy pulled out his phone, showed Glenn the profile. Kevin and Karen, at a barbecue, her arm around his waist, both smiling. "Thought you should know, in case it matters." Glenn stared at the photo. Kevin looked different here, softer, younger, like somebody's husband instead of somebody's affair. "Thanks, Roy." On the drive home, Glenn didn't turn toward the ranch, kept going toward Missoula, toward something he hadn't quite decided to do yet but couldn't stop himself from doing. 90 miles to think about whether he was the kind of man who'd blow up someone else's marriage just because his own was burning down. By the time he reached the Missoula city limits, he'd made his choice. Glenn sat in his truck outside the Missoula Public Library until nearly midnight. The building was closed, dark except for the security lights, but the parking lot had decent cell service and nobody to ask questions about why an old rancher was sitting alone in his truck at this hour. He'd pulled up Kevin Thornton's LinkedIn profile on his phone: insurance broker, State Farm, married 2019. The profile photo showed Kevin in a polo shirt and khakis, corporate smile, arm around a woman with auburn hair and a kind face. Karen Thornton. The caption read, "Celebrating 5 years with my amazing wife." Glenn clicked through to Karen's profile. Elementary school principal at Meadowlark Elementary, master's degree in education, volunteer work with literacy programs. In her photo, she wore a floral dress and held a book, surrounded by kids who looked like they actually liked her. She looked like a good person, the kind of person who didn't deserve what was coming. Glenn sat there with his phone in his hand, thumb hovering over the screen, debating with himself. Was he really going to do this? Was he really the kind of man who'd blow up an innocent woman's life just to get even? He thought about Margaret's ledger, $42,000, 8 months of lies, Emma's wedding fund stolen, Linda's words echoing in his head. "You suffocated me for 38 years. He thought about Bill's heart attack, Kenny's sister losing everything, Frank fighting for 3 years just to see his son. He thought about what Roy had said. The person who documents first is usually the person who protects what matters. Glenn found the school's website, staff directory, emergency contact information, all publicly listed for parent access. There was Karen's cell phone number, right there in black and white. He stared at those 10 digits for a long time. Then he pulled out the burner phone Roy had given him and dialed before he could change his mind. It rang 4 times. Glenn was about to hang up when a woman's voice answered, cautious. "Hello? Mrs. Thornton, my name is Glenn Hutchins. I'm calling from Montana. I apologize for calling so late, and I apologize for what I'm about to tell you." Silence on the other end. Then, "How did you get this number?" "School website, public information. Ma'am, I'm calling about your husband." "What about him?" Her voice had gone from cautious to guarded. She knew something was wrong. Women always knew. Glenn took a breath. No going back after this. He's been having an affair with my wife. I thought you should know. The silence stretched so long Glenn thought she'd hung up. Then, Kevin travels a lot for work, sales conferences. Ma'am, he was at a resort in Arizona in October with my wife Linda. Before that, Portland in April, Boise in June, Santa Fe in February. I have receipts, credit card statements, photos. Those were work trips, but her voice was shaking now. They weren't. I'm sorry, but they weren't. How do I know you're telling the truth? How do I know you're not just some... I'll email you everything. The statements, the bookings, the Venmo transfers from my wife to your husband. $4,800 over 6 months. Glenn's voice was steady, factual. No anger, just truth. And ma'am, my wife took $15,000 from our daughter's wedding fund to give to him. So I'm not calling to hurt you. I'm calling because you deserve to know before he makes a fool of you any longer. He could hear her breathing on the other end, hard and fast like she was trying not to cry. Send me everything, she said finally. I will. And Mrs. Thornton, I'm sorry you're in this. I really am. There was a pause. Then, are you divorcing your wife? Yes, ma'am. Got mediation scheduled for Friday. Kevin will be there? Her voice had changed. Still shaking, but something steel underneath now. He's been supporting her through this. I expect so. Good. One word, sharp as a knife. He'll need support when I'm done with him. Another pause, then quieter. Thank you for calling, Mr. Hutchins. I know that couldn't have been easy. No, ma'am, but it was right. Yes, she said. It was. The line went dead. Glenn sat in his truck, hands shaking now that it was done. He'd crossed a line tonight. Couldn't uncross it. But when he thought about Emma's stolen wedding fund, about Linda's systematic deception, about that smug bastard Kevin living his double life while Glenn's marriage burned, no, he didn't regret it. He started the truck and headed home. The December night, clear and cold around him, stars bright over the mountains. The encrypted email went out at 1 a.m, Margaret's audit ledger. The resort booking confirmation. Screenshots of Kevin's Instagram with Linda in the background. Every Venmo transaction. The flight change fee with Kevin's name on it. Glenn hit send and then sat there, staring at his laptop screen, feeling like he'd just dropped a bomb and was waiting for the explosion. Karen's reply came at 6:47 a.m. Received. My lawyer will contact you for coordination. Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Hutchins. More than my husband ever gave me. Glenn read it twice, then closed his laptop. He had ranch work to do, and sitting around dwelling on it wouldn't change anything. He fed the horses, checked the cattle, repaired a section of fence that had come loose in the blizzard. Normal work, steady work, the kind of work that had kept him sane for 64 years. Around noon, his regular phone rang. Roy. You doing okay? Better than okay. Mediation set for Friday, 10 a.m. My store, back office. You ready? Glenn looked out across his ranch, the mountains beyond, the life he'd built with his own 2 hands. Thought about Emma's wedding fund getting restored. Thought about Kevin's face when he realized his own wife knew everything. I'm ready, he said. That night, Glenn slept deeply for the first time in 3 weeks. No waking at 3 a.m., no lying there staring at the ceiling, mind racing. Just sleep, clean and dreamless, until his alarm went off at 5. He dreamed about fence posts, straight and solid and true. Thursday passed in a blur of preparation. David Mercer came by with papers to review, settlement terms to discuss. Margaret stopped in with the final audit, everything notarized and legal. Roy called twice, just checking in, making sure Glenn was holding up. You know she'll probably bring him, Roy said. Kevin. For moral support or intimidation or whatever. I know. You gonna be all right with that? Glenn thought about it, about seeing the man who'd helped destroy his marriage, who'd taken money from his daughter's future, who'd been living it up on Glenn's retirement savings. Yeah, he said. I'll be all right. Because he had something Kevin didn't know about. A bomb already planted, just waiting to go off. Thursday evening, Glenn stood on his porch with coffee, watching the sun set over the bitterroots. The December air was cold enough to make his breath fog, but he didn't go inside. Just stood there, coffee steaming in his chipped mug, feeling something like peace for the first time since this whole thing started. Tomorrow, it would be over. One way or another, tomorrow he'd get his dignity back. His phone buzzed. Text from David. Karen Thornton's lawyer contacted me. She's filing for divorce tomorrow morning. Wanted you to know. Glenn read it twice, then looked back at the mountains. Somewhere in Missoula, Kevin's world was about to explode, and he had no idea it was coming. Glenn took a sip of coffee. It was strong and bitter, and exactly what he needed. That's for Emma, he said to the empty air, and for every man who ever got played for a fool. The mountains didn't answer, just stood there, patient and eternal, the way they'd stood for 1,000,000 years before Glenn was born and would stand for 1,000,000 more after he was gone. Some things endured, some things broke. Tomorrow, he'd find out which kind of man he was. Friday morning arrived cold and clear. Glenn was up before dawn, showering, shaving, putting on his good jeans and the shirt Emma had bought him last Christmas. Blue cotton, pearl snaps, the kind of shirt a man wore when he needed to look respectable. He made coffee but couldn't drink it, toast but couldn't eat it, just stood at the kitchen window, watching the sun come up, feeling his pulse steady and slow. At 9:30, he climbed in his truck and headed to town, took the long way, past the grain co-op where Bill's truck was already parked, past the church where Kenny would be preparing Sunday's sermon, past the diner where he'd eaten 1,000 breakfasts over 40 years. His town, his people, his life. Linda had tried to paint him as the villain, but these streets knew different, these people knew different. And today, the truth would speak for itself. Roy's Hardware came into view at 9:50. Glenn parked, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel. Through the store's front window, he could see lights on in the back. Roy was there. Margaret would be there. David with his papers and his professional calm. And soon, Linda would be there. And Kevin, the man who'd thought he could steal another man's wife and face no consequences. Glenn smiled. Small, grim, the smile of a man who'd been underestimated and was about to prove everyone wrong. He got out of the truck, straightened his shirt, and walked inside. Time to finish this. The back office of Roy's Hardware smelled like sawdust and WD-40, familiar and grounding. Roy had set up a folding table with chairs on either side. Margaret sat in the corner with a notepad, witness to whatever was about to happen. David had his briefcase open, papers organized in neat stacks. Glenn took his seat and waited. At 10:03, Linda's car pulled up outside. Glenn watched through the window as she sat there for a full 5 minutes, hands on the wheel, staring straight ahead. Then Kevin's truck pulled in behind her, newer model, clean, the kind of vehicle a man bought to impress people. Kevin got out first, went to Linda's window. They talked for a moment, her face anxious, his confident. Then they both headed for the door. Glenn's pulse stayed steady. Hands didn't shake. He felt calm, in a way he hadn't felt in weeks, like he was standing on solid ground after months of quicksand. The door opened. Linda came in first, and Glenn barely recognized her. Hair done, makeup perfect, shoulders back like she was walking into battle. Kevin followed, and Glenn got his first real look at the man who'd helped destroy his marriage. 52, maybe? Gym fit? The kind of muscles that came from machines instead of work. Cologne strong enough to smell across the room. He extended his hand to Roy. Kevin Thornton, I'm here to support Linda. Roy's handshake was brief. Noted. They sat. Kevin's hand found Linda's under the table, and she squeezed it like a lifeline. David began. We're here to discuss settlement terms. I'm not agreeing to anything punitive, Linda interrupted. Montana is a no-fault state. What happened between Glenn and me doesn't matter legally. I know, Glenn said quietly. He slid Margaret's ledger across the table. Linda's face flushed red as she recognized it. You had someone investigate me? I had our bookkeeper review our joint accounts. That's legal. Glenn's voice was level, factual. 8 months of trips, $23,000 from our retirement savings, $4,800 in Venmo transfers to Kevin, $15,000 from Emma's wedding fund. Kevin leaned over to look at the ledger, and his eyes went wide. He whispered something to Linda, but Glenn caught it. You took $43,000? Linda hissed back, not now. Glenn slid the settlement offer across. Simple terms. You keep your mother's house in town. I keep the ranch. We each contribute $20,000 to restore Emma's fund. Clean split. That's outrageous, Linda started. That house is worth $180,000 paid off. David interrupted smoothly. The ranch is worth $400,000 with $240,000 in debt against it. Net value $160,000. You're getting the better deal financially, Mrs. Hutchins. Linda looked at Kevin. He wouldn't meet her eyes, staring instead at the ledger like it was a snake that might bite him. I need time to think about... Your wife Karen called me last week. Glenn said, his voice still calm, still factual, looking directly at Kevin now. Kevin's head snapped up, face draining of color. She didn't know about Arizona, or Portland, or Boise, or the money Linda was sending you. Glenn paused, let it sink in. She knows now. Kevin stood up so fast his chair scraped loud against the floor. I don't have to. Sit down or leave, Glenn said. Your choice. Kevin looked at Linda, and Glenn saw it happen in real time. The calculation, the self-preservation, the moment when Kevin decided that supporting Linda wasn't worth losing his own marriage over. I should go, Kevin said. This is between you two. This is your marriage, not mine. Kevin, wait. Linda reached for him, but he was already backing toward the door. I'll call you later, Kevin said, but they both knew he wouldn't. The door opened, closed. Kevin's footsteps fast across the store, the ding of the front door, his truck starting up outside. Linda stared at the empty doorway, and Glenn watched 38 years of marriage crystallize into this single moment, her realizing that the man she'd burned everything for had just abandoned her at the first sign of consequence. You called his wife, Linda said, voice breaking. You turned her against him. No, Glenn said. He did that himself. Just like you did this. The silence in the room was thick enough to choke on. Margaret's pen scratched against paper, documenting everything. Roy stood by the door, arms crossed, solid as a fence post. Linda's hands were shaking. Her makeup was running, mascara tracking down her cheeks. She looked smaller somehow, like she was collapsing inward. He made me feel alive, she whispered. You made me feel invisible. Then we both failed, Glenn said. But Emma didn't fail anyone. She gets her fund back. That's non-negotiable. David pushed the settlement papers closer. Mrs. Hutchins, this is fair, more than fair. The alternative is discovery phase, where every transaction, every text message, every detail becomes public record. He paused. Emma will have to know everything. Your sister Carol will have to know. The church will have to know. Linda picked up the pen with a shaking hand, stared at the signature line like it was a death sentence. If I sign this, it's over? The marriage is over regardless, David said gently. This just determines how it ends. Linda signed. The pen scratched across paper, her hand trembling so badly the signature was barely legible. She pushed it across the table. Glenn signed with a steady hand, no tremor, no hesitation. It's done, David said. I'll file this afternoon. Linda stood, wouldn't look at anyone. Her purse slipped off her shoulder and she caught it, fumbling. I did love you once, she whispered. I know, Glenn said. I did too. She left without another word. They heard her car door slam, the engine turn over, tires on gravel fading into nothing. Glenn sat there, staring at the papers with both their signatures, feeling nothing and everything at once. Roy's hand landed on his shoulder. That's how it's done, Glenn. Glenn couldn't speak, just nodded. His throat was too tight, and somewhere behind his ribs, something that had been clenched for weeks was finally starting to let go. Let's get you home, Roy said. Spring came the way it always did in Montana, reluctant, grudging, the snow taking its sweet time about melting. By March, the meadowlarks were back. By April, the pastures had greened up enough to move the cattle. By May, it felt like maybe the world hadn't ended after all. The old bulls started showing up on Saturdays. Roy, Bill, Kenny, Frank, Dale. They'd pull up in their trucks with tools and thermoses of coffee, and they'd work on whatever needed working on. Fence lines, barn roof, the water trough that kept freezing. They didn't talk much, didn't need to, just worked in that comfortable silence men who'd known each other for decades could share. Emma came to visit in April. Glenn saw her car coming up the drive, and his stomach clenched, but he made himself stay on the porch, made himself be steady. She hugged him tight when she got out. Dad. Hey, sweetheart. They sat on the porch with coffee, and she didn't dance around it. Mom told me you're divorcing. Is it true? Yeah. Was there someone else? Glenn looked at his daughter, 28, smart, too much like him for her own good. She had his eyes, Linda's cheekbones, and a spine made of steel. Yes, he said. But that's between your mother and me. Did you cheat? No. She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. Okay. Your wedding fund is still there, Glenn said. Every penny, plus what we originally planned. Emma's eyes filled. She set down her coffee cup and hugged him again, harder this time. Thank you, For what? For not making this my problem. Her voice was muffled against his shoulder. For letting me just be your daughter instead of making me pick sides. Glenn kissed the top of her head. It never was your problem. Won't ever be. She pulled back, wiped her eyes. Tyler's good, Dad. I promise. You'll like him. I already do, Glenn said. Any man who makes you smile like that is all right by me. June arrived with heat and wildflowers and the kind of blue skies that made you forget winter ever existed. Emma's wedding was on a Saturday, at a barn venue 20 miles outside town that had been converted into something fancy. White chairs, string lights, the whole production. Glenn wore his good suit, the same one from Emma's baptism 28 years ago. Still, fit, barely. He helped Tyler set up chairs that morning, the kid nervous but earnest, and Glenn found himself liking him more with every passing hour. Thank you for this, Tyler said while they were wrestling with the last row. For the wedding, for Emma, for not making things weird with the divorce and everything. Glenn straightened, hands on his lower back. She loves you. That's all that matters to me. I'll take care of her, sir. I promise. I know you will. Glenn shook his hand. And you can call me Glenn. Linda arrived late, parked in the back. Glenn saw her through the window, alone, wearing sunglasses even though the sun was behind clouds. She slipped into the last row and stayed there, small and separate from everyone else. Glenn heard through Roy that Kevin had divorced and moved to Spokane, selling insurance remotely now, staying away from Montana like it might burn him. Karen had sent Glenn a Christmas card with a note. Thank you for the truth. Found someone honest now. Hope you did too. Glenn hadn't found anyone, wasn't looking, but he'd found something else. Peace, maybe, or at least the absence of war. The ceremony started at 4. Glenn stood outside the bridal room, and when Emma opened the door, his breath caught. She looked like her mother had 38 years ago, but somehow more herself, radiant, ready. Ready to give me away, Dad? Never giving you away, just walking you towards something good. She laughed, wiped her eyes. Don't make me cry yet. The processional music started. Glenn offered his arm, and Emma took it, and they walked down that aisle together while everyone stood and sobbed. Glenn saw Tyler at the altar. Good kid, nervous, genuine. And he saw the old bulls in the third row, all of them in Sunday suits, all of them nodding at him like he'd done something worth doing. He saw Margaret in a floral dress, waving. He saw Linda in the back row, alone. Slow down, Dad, Emma whispered. Let me remember this. So he slowed, and they walked it together, father and daughter, one last time before she became somebody's wife. When they reached the altar, the pastor asked, Who gives this woman in marriage? Glenn's voice was strong and clear. I do, proudly. He hugged Emma, shook Tyler's hand with a grip that said everything his words couldn't. Take care of her. I will, sir. Glenn sat in the front row and watched his daughter get married, and when she said her vows about parents who showed me love looks different for everyone, he knew she was speaking to both him and Linda, trying to hold them both with grace. The reception was a blur of music and food and people congratulating him, but the moment that mattered came during the father-daughter dance. Unforgettable played, and Emma rested her head on his shoulder, and they swayed to music that was older than both of them. Thank you for not making me choose sides, she whispered. Glenn's eyes burned, first tears since the mediation, hot and unexpected. You never had to choose. I know what you protected me from. I'm not stupid, and you're the smartest person I know. You're the steady one, Dad. Always have been. She squeezed his hand. I love you, and I'm proud of you. Glenn couldn't speak, just held her tighter while the song played out. When it ended, Emma kissed his cheek and went back to Tyler, back to her new life, back to a future Glenn had made sure she could have. He stepped outside, needing air. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting everything gold and red. Roy appeared with 2 beers, handed one over without a word. They stood there in silence, drinking, watching the light fade. You did good, Glenn, Roy finally said. Real good. Doesn't feel like winning. That's how you know it was worth doing. The week after the wedding, Glenn woke up to silence. Not the bad kind. The kind that had pressed on him like a weight during those dark December days. This was clean silence. Empty, but in a way that felt more like space than void. He made coffee, fed the horses, checked the fence line in the back pasture where the old bulls had helped him rebuild. Every post straight and solid, wire strung tight. Good work, the kind that would last. Emma called on Tuesday, back from her honeymoon at Glacier. Dad, the account, the wedding fund, it's all there. 40,000 exactly. That's what we promised you. I know, but her voice caught. Thank you for everything you didn't say, for everything you carried so I didn't have to. That's what fathers do, honey. After they hung up, Glenn sat on his porch with his second cup of coffee and thought about that, about carrying things, about how some loads were meant to be borne alone, not because you were too proud to share them, but because sharing them would just spread the hurt around. Linda had wanted him to talk more, to share more, to be less like his father. Maybe she'd been right about that, but maybe there was a difference between silence that shut people out and silence that protected them. He was still learning which was which. Saturday morning, the old bulls showed up unannounced, just like they had every weekend since March. This time, Dale had his smoker in the bed of his truck, already producing thin ribbons of smoke that smelled like hickory and promise. Brisket's been on since 4 a.m., Dale announced. Figured we earned a proper meal after all that fence work. They spent the morning finishing the last section of fence line, the same one Glenn had been working on back in December when this whole thing started. Full circle. When the last post was driven, Bill stepped up back and nodded. That'll hold. Damn right it will, Frank said. They ate at noon, sitting on tailgates, paper plates balanced on knees. The brisket was perfect, smoky and tender, the kind of meat that fell apart with a fork. Dale had brought beans and coleslaw. Roy had brought beer. Kenny had brought his guitar, though nobody asked him to play it yet. Glenn, Bill said, mouth half full. You thought any more about that Black Angus breeding stock? Yeah, thinking I'll make the switch next spring. Better market, like you said. They talked cattle and whether the Broncos had any chance this year. Normal talk, rancher talk, the kind of conversation that didn't need anything heavy in it because the heavy stuff had already been dealt with. Around 2, when the food was gone and the beer was down to backwash, Roy leaned back against his truck. This is good. This right here. Damn good, Dale agreed. Kenny picked up his guitar, strummed a few chords, started playing something old, something Glenn remembered from church when he was a kid. The others didn't sing along, just listened. And somehow that felt right, just letting the music be music, letting the afternoon be what it was. When they left, around 4, Glenn walked each man to his truck. Handshakes all around, no words needed. They'd be back next month, and the month after that, and the month after that. Not because Glenn needed them to be, but because this was what men did. Showed up, stood together, built things that lasted. After they were gone, Glenn cleaned up the paper plates and beer cans, stood in his driveway as the sun started its slow slide toward the mountains. His ranch, his land, his life, rebuilt from the rubble. Different now, smaller in some ways, bigger in others. He was alone, but he'd learned there was a difference between alone and lonely. Alone was a choice. Lonely was a prison. He chose alone. Monday, Margaret stopped by with a folder. Final papers from David, she said, handing them over. Everything's official now. Divorce finalized. Your half of the ranch is secure, free and clear. Emma's fund transferred to her account Friday. Glenn signed where she indicated. His signature was steady, no hesitation. 6 months ago, signing these papers would have felt like failure. Now it just felt like closing a door that should have been closed a long time ago. How you holding up? Margaret asked. Better than I expected. She studied him for a moment, then smiled. Small, but genuine. Glenn, you did the hard thing. Not the loud thing, not the cruel thing, the hard thing. That matters. Didn't feel like I had much choice. You did. You chose dignity. She gathered her papers, headed for the door, then turned back. Emma called me. Wanted to say thank you. She knows, Glenn. Maybe not all the details, but she knows what you protected her from. That girl's proud of her father. After Margaret left, Glenn sat at his kitchen table with the finalized divorce papers spread out in front of him. 38 years, reduced to legal language and notarized signatures, property division, asset allocation, dissolution of marriage. The words looked cold on paper. Didn't capture the good years, the hard years, the years when they'd been happy, or at least happy enough. Didn't capture the moment Emma was born, or the first year on the ranch when they'd had nothing but hope and stubbornness, or the 1,000 small kindnesses that had built a life together. But it also didn't capture the lies, the betrayal, the systematic dismantling of trust, the cruelty of her words in that final fight. Some things couldn't be captured, could only be lived through. Glenn folded the papers, put them in the filing cabinet next to the deed to the ranch and Emma's birth certificate. Part of the record now, part of history, but not part of today. That evening, Glenn did something he hadn't done in months. He drove into town, pulled up to the grain co-op where Bill and Frank were loading feed into Frank's truck. Didn't hesitate, just climbed out and walked over. "Need a hand?" he called. Bill looked up, grinned. "Glenn, yeah, grab that end." They loaded feed together, talking about nothing important. When they were done, Frank said, "Coffee's on inside if you want some." Glenn followed them in. The coffee station was exactly like it had been 6 months ago, a year ago, 10 years ago. Same pot, same mugs, same burnt smell. He poured himself a cup and stood with Bill and Frank, and after a minute, Dale came in, then Kenny. Nobody mentioned Linda, nobody mentioned the divorce, nobody asked if he was okay, or offered sympathy, or treated him like he was fragile. They just talked about the upcoming county fair, about whether they should get a pool going on the football season, about Dale's granddaughter who'd just gotten accepted to Montana State. Normal conversation, normal life. Glenn realized, standing there with burnt coffee in his hand and these men around him, that this was what restoration looked like. Not fireworks, not dramatic moments, just showing up, being present, letting life be life. "Same time next week?" Bill asked as they were heading out. "I'll be here," Glenn said, and he meant it. Tuesday evening found Glenn on his porch again, coffee in his chipped mug, watching storm clouds clear over the Bitterroots. They'd been building all afternoon, threatening rain that never came. Now they were breaking apart, late sun streaming through the gaps, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple. The meadowlarks were settling in for the night. Their evening song carried across the pasture, familiar and eternal. Glenn's fence line stretched into the distance, post straight, wire tight. Good work, lasting work. He thought about Emma, married now, happy, starting her own life with her $40,000 nest egg intact. Thought about the old bulls, showing up every Saturday without being asked. Thought about Margaret's words. "You chose dignity." Had he, or had he just survived? Maybe it was the same thing. Glenn took a sip of coffee. It was strong and bitter and exactly what he needed. His hands didn't shake. His chest didn't feel like concrete anymore. He could breathe deep, full breaths that expanded his lungs and made him feel like he was actually taking in air instead of just going through the motions. The loneliness was still there. Probably always would be. You didn't share 38 years with someone and then walk away clean. But it was different now. Clean, like Margaret had said. No lies underneath it. No performance. No wondering what was real and what was pretend. Just him, the ranch, the work, the seasons turning like they always had, like they always would. Glenn realized, sitting there as the sun set and the stars started coming out, that dignity wasn't about Linda's approval, wasn't about Kevin's downfall, wasn't even about community validation, though that helped. Dignity was about not betraying yourself when everything else was falling apart. He'd made choices, some hard, some that crossed lines he'd never thought he'd cross, but he'd made them to protect what mattered: Emma's future, his ranch, the truth that Linda had tried to rewrite. And he could live with those choices. More than that, he could stand on his porch at dusk, coffee in hand, and feel something that might not be happiness but was close enough. Peace, maybe, or at least the absence of war. Tomorrow, there'd be fence to check, cattle to move, life to live. But tonight, there was this: clean air, clear sky, solid ground beneath his feet. Glenn closed his eyes and let himself feel it. The evening breeze on his face, the cooling coffee in his hand, the mountains standing patient and eternal beyond his land. He'd survived. He'd protected what mattered. He was still standing. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Glenn stood there on his porch until the stars came out in full force, the kind of display you only got this far from city lights. The Big Dipper, Orion's Belt. Constellations his father had taught him to find when he was 8 years old, standing in this same spot, on this same porch. Some things endured. He thought about his father then, really thought about him for the first time in years. The old man had died at 72, same recliner Glenn had sat in during his darkest days, silent to the end. Glenn had spent half his life resenting that silence, the other half inheriting it. Maybe Linda had been right about that part. Maybe he had been too much like his father, too quiet, too stoic, letting work speak where words should have. But his father had also taught him this. A man's worth wasn't in what he said. It was in what he built, what he protected, what he left behind for the next generation. Glenn had protected Emma, had kept the ranch, had walked away from his marriage with his dignity intact and his daughter's future secure. His father would have understood that, even if Linda never did. The coffee had gone cold in his hand, but Glenn didn't go inside to reheat it. just set the mug on the porch railing and looked out at his land. 400 acres of Montana that had been in his family for 3 generations would be here for 3 more if Emma's kids ever wanted it. Legacy wasn't about perfect marriages or happy endings. It was about doing right when doing wrong would have been easier. It was about standing when falling would have been simpler. It was about protecting what mattered, even when the cost was high. Glenn had paid that cost, worn it like a brand, but he was still standing. The house behind him was quiet, empty, his. Tomorrow he'd wake with the sun, feed the horses, check the fence, live another day. And the day after that, he'd do it again. That was the victory, he realized. Not happiness, not vindication, just continuation, just showing up, just being steady when the world tried to knock you sideways. His father had been right about one thing: silence wasn't always weakness. Sometimes it was the strongest thing a man could be. Glenn picked up his mug, empty now, and turned toward the door. Inside, the kitchen light was still on, warm and yellow against the darkness. He'd leave it on tonight, a light in the window, proof of life continuing. He crossed the threshold, home and whole and alone. And that was enough.